We now begin with the first morning session panel, Food System Resilience, Framing the Concepts of Resilience and Equity for Food Systems. This will be with Dr. Colette Pierce-Burnett, President of Houston-Tillotson University, Ruben Cantu, Executive Director of the Office of Inclusive Innovation and Entrepreneurship at UT Austin, Alba Sereno from the City of Austin Resilience, and moderator Claire Zutz of Dell Foundation. In this session, the panel will begin by defining key terms including food systems, resilience, and equity, and how framing food systems work as a type of resilience that can be helpful, but also how a resilience framework might also limit or stunt food systems.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Claire Zutz and I will be moderating the panel this morning. I want to thank everybody for joining. We're excited to participate in the morning main stage panel on framing concepts of resilience and equity for food systems. I also have to just say I'm really excited that we're having a local conference here on food systems. I've only been here for about 8 years, but it's the first in my recollection. So I just want to give a big shout out to the Cook's Nook and everyone who came together to get this conference off the ground. I know that they mentioned this in the intro, but just wanted to say it again. If you're having any tech issues, there will be a tech booth in the sessions portion on the page, so you can jump in there. I feel like our wonderful friends at Hopin are also kind of in the ether, so you can probably just drop it in the chat as well, and they will help you out. So we're going to start with introductions, and then I'll provide a brief overview of kind of the what and the why of this panel, and then we'll dive into a deeper conversation on framing resilience and equity, and then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleagues to introduce themselves. And Dr. Pierce-Burnett, if you'd like to start.
Of course, Claire, thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is one of those moments in Austin of innovation and moving forward to embrace a super important topic. And I'm very proud to be here and humbled this morning. I'm Colette Pierce-Burnett. I serve Houston-Tillotson University as the President and CEO. And I'll pass the baton to Alba.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in and for letting us be part of this conversation that everybody's having today. My name is Alba Sereno, and I am the inaugural Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Austin. And it has been my honor to work in the Austin community for some years as in different roles, wearing different hats. Doing community organizing, working at government institutions and local-based nonprofits, always looking for a better situation for all of us, and that certainly involves resilience, but also very key equity, which I know we're going to talk about today. So it's my pleasure to be speaking with you all today and with these wonderful co-panelists. Without them, we really would not make progress on our lofty goals. So I'll pass it to Ruben.
Thank you, Alba. Can you hear me? It is my pleasure to be here. My name is Ruben Cantu, and I am the Executive Director of the Office of Inclusive Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the University of Texas inside the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement, and I'm also the co-founder of the Community Resilience Trust.
Great. And as I mentioned, I'm Claire Zutz. I am the moderator for this panel, and I am a doctoral student at UT Austin in community regional planning. And my focus is on some of the challenges and opportunities to operationalizing resilience for food systems planning. A mouthful. And I also work at the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation on the health portfolio and manage some of our food-related grantees. So I'm just super excited and feel very humbled and grateful to be on here with these panelists and to get to really to have the opportunity to share their knowledge and experience with a larger audience. So on to the kind of the meat, the what and the why. Throughout the next 2 days, you'll get to sit in on various sessions where the concepts of equity and resilience will come up. And obviously, as we just heard, from Daniel Nuremberg in the keynote, they started to kind of talk about some of these definitions, you know, the kind of origins of resilience being related to, withstanding shocks and kind of the ecological strain, and then this kind of movement back to the socio-ecological framing of kind of bouncing back better. And we also heard them ask about if equity is definable. So we'll get into that as well. But our goal with this panel is to dig into those concepts, to think about resilience for who and for what, some of the politics around resilience, but to also have a shared understanding of some of these concepts as we move through the conference. And we also really just wanted to provide some time to reflect on these concepts before we're kind of immersed in breakout sessions. A few notes. So we just talked about what this panel is, but we also want to talk about maybe what it isn't. So this isn't going to be a theoretical conversation about the definitions, right? We're here to talk about equity and resilience and do some storytelling about how it shows up in work, some of the misconceptions, et cetera. Though if anybody offline wants to talk about those kind of that theoretical conversation, would love to as an academic. And then just another note that, that we talked about and we think is important to highlight is that, this really isn't just about COVID. So while the conference came together due to COVID, and COVID has kind of shined a really important light on some of the issues of inequity and vulnerability in our community, they've always been there, and they're not a result of COVID, rather the systems and the structures in our society. So as we try to take advantage of this time and what has been illuminated by COVID, we also want to remember that these issues are really systemic in nature. And then just lastly, as a reminder, we will leave time at the end for Q&A, and then you'll be able to drop questions in the chat. So hoping that all the panelists would like to answer this, but I think I just wanted to start out with a question around kind of what do the concepts of equity and resilience mean to you, and how do they show up in your work?
I'll give it a shot. Thank you, Claire. When we started the office 2 years ago, we came under the guise of how do we create a pathway for generational wealth? And, it was out of the response of what's happening in East Austin. As many of y'all know me in the community, I am a proud native East Austinite. And I kept thinking, it doesn't matter if we just graduate students. That's the first step. What really is centered is, can we get them to stay here, open up businesses, revitalize the economy, and recreate a space that belongs to them as well, instead of being pushed out. So to me, equity really is analogous to, it's an aftermath of understanding the concept of ownership. And I don't mean like centralized ownership. I mean in a equitable manner where everyone has a seat at the table, everyone has a piece of the pie, everyone has their own power and agency to be able to contribute to the larger whole. And right now, we don't have a lot of people being able to fairly and equitably contribute to the economy. And so to me, I always start with that space before equality, equity, and before equity, ownership, and getting really centered on having our students and our community really be centered on what slice of the pie are we able to own from the entire supply chain. So today we're talking about food, but we can talk about the entire supply chain of whatever industry you're in. What piece of the pie are you owning?
I really appreciate kind of the point about ownership, and I think that will probably come up kind of in multiple spaces in this conversation. And one thing I should have said too in the beginning is I'm really excited to have panelists who obviously think about food and care about food, but aren't working directly in food, because we know that these are cross-cutting issues. So I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Pierce-Burnett, about how it kind of shows up in your work as well.
So education is known as the great equalizer. The more education you have, the more opportunities you have. For example, if I had stopped at high school, I wouldn't be in Austin, Texas, serving as a university president on this panel with you, because my education, if you will, my formal education and my life education offers me more opportunities. And there is a big difference between equality and equity. Ruben touched on that. Equality in the 1960s with the passing of the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement, we reached equality. And then the nation, in my view, was lulled to sleep. And we have most recently been abruptly shaken awake to realize that there may be equality, but there is no equity. And equity means opportunities for all. Whether a person takes advantage of those opportunities is another conversation, or wants the opportunity is another conversation. But equity is that the opportunities are available. And in my work and serving at Houston-Tillotson, over half of our students have an estimated family contribution of less than $10,000. So they're in that population that the big flashlight has been shined on as a result of COVID, of all of the nation's pre-existing conditions. That term is passed around a lot. So we had these systemic pre-existing conditions, and all of a sudden something tragic happens in the light of COVID-19 and all of the other things that are happening around us, in the political world, everywhere. So there's this huge flashlight that has now spotted just how much inequity are in our food systems. And in all of our systems, there's disparities in our healthcare, economic development, et cetera. So conferences and moments like this give us an opportunity to look at what the spotlight has shown us, and then to think through strategically how we make systemic changes over time so that these systems can become equitable, so that we can get out of our language words like systemic inequities and institutional racism and all of the systems that serve us. And so many of us take so much for granted, stopping at the HEB, or going to Whole Foods and 2 cookies for $10, stopping at the HEB and, going on and living your life. But there's so many of our fellow citizens that do not live in that world because it's not equitable.
Yeah. And I think, your point on equity as like the opportunities that are available for all, or making them available for all, will be such a critical part, especially in this conference and when we're kind of thinking through these different sessions and how we're working on different aspects of the food system. Alba, I want to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I had the interesting challenge some years back when the Equity Office was starting at the city, to lead the working group on the definition of equity for the city. And what a challenge that was, right? It's very easy to intellectualize these concepts. And so I am always interested in, as we colloquially say, the receipts, right? Ultimately, I don't want to have a definition floating around unless we think about how it comes back to the reality of people's lives. And so what we tried to do in coming up with a working definition of equity for the city of Austin as an institution was to think about those receipts. And the definition that we came up with there is very simple. It's about making sure that one, we are centering around racial equity. That is very important, given the outcomes for people show consistently that it is on the praxis of race that people have disproportional different outcomes, more or less opportunity, more or less privilege, right, in our city and our society. That is inarguable based on the data. And so we said equity is a state of affairs, a state of a situation when people's race does not determine their outcomes. And that's how we will know when we have reached equity, right? When then we can look around and say that we have the same opportunity, when we have ability to thrive to the maximum of each of our potentials, despite the structures that are in place. And it will take the dismantling of many things in order to reach that sort of state when race does not determine people's outcomes. And so I think within that, it is really important, I think, to think about how there's a relationship with equity and resilience, where resilience is maybe a tool in the toolkit. But if we're thinking about equity as the ultimate state that we're trying to get to, we got to gather a lot of tools and have them work together. And some of those tools have been already mentioned by my co-panelists about how they're working with that. How do these concepts show up in my daily work? It is about making sure that everything I do in practice holds an equity lens as we build out now for the first time what will be the methodology of resilience that we will operate under with the city. that practically looks like building that out with the residents who are most challenged and who are experiencing the most challenges to their resilience, right? It's not that they are causing the problems to themselves or that they're doing that because of who they are. It's that we are causing problems on them and challenging their resilience. And so we are working now to lift up our effort in a way where we are designing that with residents themselves and talking to people about what it would mean to design an equitable, comprehensive resilience planning process, and listening to residents' bottom line on that in order to design that. So that's just a little bit about how it's showing up currently in my work.
Great. I love the idea of receipts. I think that's a great way to think about that. And I guess I'm wondering, as I'm hearing you talk, I feel like that's a really useful kind of framing for the concept of equity. And typically when we have a better kind of shared understanding of a term, there are less like misconceptions around it. And I'm wondering how the panel feels about the term like resilience, because I know a lot of times there are conversations about sustainability and how it means everything to everyone. So it's a little more challenging for it to mean something specific or powerful, but then also at the same time, there is some power in having a term that is broadly used. So I'm just interested to hear kind of how you feel about any misconceptions around the concept of resilience or what you would want people to kind of come away from. And Dr. Collette, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yes, I would love to go first on this one. It's because this has been an evolution for me, because I consistently tout Houston-Tillotson as very resilient. It's 145 years old, 146 years old. We just had our celebrated the 146th year, founded 10 years after the Civil War, in 1875. And the oldest institution of higher learning in Austin. And with all the challenges in East Austin, the challenges in Austin, the growth of University of Texas, the challenges that we've had, I consistently talk about the institution's resilience, even through COVID-19. To lift an institution within 2 weeks to go fully online shows the campus's resilience. And my sister is in this work of equity and inclusion. She's been doing it for maybe over 20 years. And I was talking to her once, and I was saying about my institution being resilient. And she shared with me that she does some work with Flint, Michigan, given their challenges with the water period. And she said she was in a meeting with some community members, and someone was commending the community members about their resilience. And one of the elderly Black females, lifetime Flint residents stood up and said, "At what point does resilience become abuse?" And that really, really resonated with me as the president of an institution who has had to be resilient for its survival. And that resilience is what's taking us from surviving to thriving. So we don't want Alba to have to serve as a chief resilience officer for a very long time, because we want to get to a place where we don't require our citizens to be resilient just to have equity. Because resilience is absorbing the shock, getting stronger, and coming back and absorbing more shocks. So at what point does it become abusive that we as a community, a beloved community that we strive to be, are no longer requiring any of our students to be resilient just to have a good quality life? So that has been an evolution. My language, my narrative around Houston-Tillotson has changed as a result of that. Because yes, we have been resilient, but we want to move to thriving, where you don't need to be resilient just to thrive.
I think that's such a great point that you raised, and I think that's what Danielle was alluding to in the keynote, that when we used to talk about plants or something, having them adapt to harsher conditions as climate changes, et cetera. But then when we're talking about like the resilience of like individuals and communities and like the actual need to adapt because the systems aren't serving them. And the idea that that can become abuse, I think, is a really helpful way to think about that. And Alba, I don't know if you wanted to, if you were going to jump in.
Yeah, sure. I'll build on that. I think that the field of resilience grew out of the field of sort of disaster response and climate resilience, right? And so it has continued to evolve its definitions. And so one of the most compelling kind of frameworks that I have looked at talks about resilience in terms of three types of resilience capacity: the capacity of absorption, adaptation, and transformation. And I'm really glad that transformation is in there, because when we look at the kind of parallel ideas, when we think about equity concepts, when we get to transformation is when we get to really talk about structural change. And we know that it takes structural change in order to more permanently get out of the sort of hamster wheel situations that we are in, where we are asking people to be resilient over and over in the face of shocks and stressors, right? Transformation asks for us to look at how we no longer cause people to have those interfaces with shocks and stressors. And the other thing that I think I want to build on to what Dr. Colette Pierce-Burnett laid out is that there was originally a lot of attention in the field to shock type of events, like acute situations that people experience, like what we're experiencing now, and we're experiencing multiple of those over the last year, right? But I think that the thing that we need to sort of dig a little deeper on perhaps is the stressors, right? Stressors are ongoing situations of challenge that people experience. And the truth is, and as COVID has shown us, the bottom falls out more completely, right? When we leave people to, in an ongoing way, experience those stressors, and then something acute happens. And that is an even more difficult situation for those people who were already constantly suffering the effects of our institutions, of being left out, of what we don't provide on an ongoing basis, right? So the truth is that I think our kind of stretch goal, our reach goal for those of us working in resilience is, one, to ground our work in equity, as we were talking about previously, but also to dig in deep on the stressors, because that is really where we have to take the mask off, right, and do the deeper work so that we can really think about that third level of structural change and transformation that's going to get us closer to that state of equity that we talked about earlier. And so I always give the example, for instance, of Mother Cyborg. She is an amazing community leader in Detroit. And she's a DJ, so if you enjoy music, you'll want to look her up for that reason. But there's a bunch of other reasons to also look at her work. And so she's been doing this work actually in the field of digital inclusion. There's a small documentary about her, and one of the opening scenes, one of the residents working with her in that work says, you know, it's incredible that we have to build our own infrastructure to have access to the internet, right? And then we also have to go build our own infrastructure to have access to food, our housing, all these other things. And where are these institutions that are public serving institutions? Why are we having to do that on top of living our daily life? And that's a super impacting statement. And I look at the work that Mother Cyborg and residents have done in Detroit around digital infrastructure and data rights. In one way, they have been extremely adaptive, right? The infrastructure wasn't there for them, so they built it themselves. They started with literacy work on digital literacy and said, wait a second, we're teaching people how to use computers and all of these things, but there's nothing for them to plug into because there's no infrastructure here for them to actually have access. So they had to take it upon themselves to build that. Well, my question is, why did we have to have people in a situation where they had to be adaptive to that level to build that, when for other people that is afforded and given and provided? And so we have to ask ourselves those hard questions, and we have to strive to look at the stress that people are constantly undergoing, not just when a shock happens, but outside of that. That commitment has to remain and stay true, because we're not trying to bounce back to awful situations that we were already asking people to live in. We have to do better, and that's the type of do better that I want to see and work for.
Claire, I can hop in. If we're familiar with the hero's journey arc narrative of stories, there's this life as it was, then something happens, a crisis, a calamity, and then how the hero is going to survive through and then come back to a happy ending. But the truth is, there's never, ever a time when you go back to the way things were. We will never go back to the time, before 9/11, like most recent memory. We'll never go back before a time there was an insurrection at the Capitol. I would never imagine to see that. I laid down that groundwork to start talking about this continuum of growth. And if you can start thinking about it as a kind of a spiral or a helix, there's phases that we go in where there's a disaster and there's recovery. As every time we spiral up, and to me, I'm spiraling up in this situation, I'm pointing to how we move from stasis to crisis to resiliency. But when we come back around, it's never quite normal again. It's hopefully this mindset, like Dr. Collette alluded to, that we're stronger. So adopting this anti-fragile mindset, this anti-fragility concept, and how we move from resilience to anti-fragility is really where the conversation should be headed. And basically at the core definition is we've anticipated already ahead of time so that if that ever happens again, just like our immune system, it's ready for it. And so we're able to quickly adapt, and we have the systems and process in place. I also wanted to address and build on top of Dr. Colette Pierce Burnett's question about, the comment that her sister had heard from this older lady. At what point does it become abuse? I think in order for us to grow, there's stressors that need to be created in present, right? Sometimes we need challenges to grow. There's a difference, though. There's a distinction I want to make. There's a stressor and choice I choose to take on. For example, if I want to go get an Ironman, I have to put myself into shape, right? That's just, I chose that. When we are living in a context and an environment upon where stressors are being placed on us that are inequitable, unfair, unjust, and we're, when you look at the data, we're intentionally created that way, intentionally or even by negligence. But then when we know about the negligence and we still don't do anything about it, we perpetuate the system and the institution that created it, that's abuse. And so basically taking advantage of what the capacity is of what people who are already being stressed and just trying to survive and saying, well, you come from a strong people, you should be able to do more. And I was like, you go through what we're going through, right? And so it's creating that distinction of abuse happens when we are not honoring the dignity of the individual and what they deserve and what they the respect that they deserve. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Yes, we all need challenges. We're all human beings, but abuse happens when we take advantage of other people and their ability to survive.
Well, I want to thank you for addressing that question, because I saw it in the chat, and I think that was a really useful way to frame it. And I think just jumping back to what Alva said about the 3 different kind of levels of absorption, adaptation, and then transformation. It's like in that transformation, people have to have like agency to be a part of that, right? And if we aren't allowing that, and if that's not even possible, how can we ever really move to transformation? And I guess, this is kind of a local conference, but we also have some people from across the country. But I did want to just spend a little bit of time talking about kind of how you think Austin and Central Texas kind of shape the efforts to move the needle in regards to equity and resilience.
Well, I'm just going to go ahead and out Alba and say that I'm glad that their conversation that initially emerged from the mayor and the task force that was created on institutional racism, ultimately, and Alba playing a key role, and Dr. Pierce Burnett also playing a key role in making that possible is why we're having this conversation today. Having even 5 years ago, having a conversation, or 6 years ago, having a conversation about institutionalized racism, most cities are not even having that conversation. Well, now, as of climate, after George Floyd, I think we are. But even prior to George Floyd, we weren't having that conversation about how much, and we were seeing, the inaccountability from police departments, et cetera, throughout the whole system. And this caused everyone to get a wake-up call. So I just want to recognize that our city continues to be thought leaders in the space, but we still have a lot more to go. But I want to recognize these two ladies here on the panel because they're pillars in this conversation of how we move forward. And I think if we don't have that conversation, we keep presenting it over and over again and beating that drum, people's attention is easily swayed to other things. And so we need to continue driving that conversation. As the vision that we created Community Resilience Trust as is asking the key question, how might we make Austin the most equitable city in the country, starting with the response to the pandemic of 2019? These are the kind of conversations and then actions, not just conversations, but actions that we're trying to put into place, into action. And so I want to thank all the entire CRT, and some of them may be watching right now, for the amazing work that they've done in terms of food resiliency, after school, return to school, research for the Latino community. The list goes on, but this is what we're doing and putting things into action and moving the needle forward towards equity.
Yes, just to amplify what Ruben is saying, this has been a long fight. For my people, it's 400 years, according to the 1619 Project. 402 years. So I'm proud of the circles that I'm in and how they are beating the drum. I worry that the drum beat will stop when we reach herd immunity. I do worry about that. And people go and relax again in our privilege. And that's all of us. So that is something that when they say what goes bump in the night, that's one of the things that goes bump in the night for me, that this does not continue to be a movement, but instead it's a moment in history. I'm encouraged by all of the elevated conversations that are happening here in Austin, because, back to the famous 1928 plan here in Austin, which is one of the scars on Austin's history. It has to be this continuing reconciliation and healing, and it takes time for that. So this conversation has been happening, but it has not been happening on the main stage. It has not been happening on all stages. So for those of us who live on the main stage and operate on the main stage, you have to continue to, I really like what Ruben said, continue to beat that drum and not lose your will, because it takes a lot of courage to move, to be resilient. Use that term again. It requires all of us to be resilient and not shy away from those courageous and hard conversations because we feel some threat to us. And that's hard. It takes a lot of political will. It takes a lot of human courage. It takes people to be empowered. It takes people to be informed. There are 2 books out on racism right now and just inequities, et cetera, that are very popular books, and that's Caste and The Color of Law. Austin is in both of those books. So I encourage all Austinites, you want to know about your history so it's not repeated, that you put that on your reading list. There are several things, a way to study our history so that you understand other people's perspectives of how we got to here in the city, in the city. And all of our children's future depends on all of us to be in a place of what, to continue to use that term, the definition of a beloved community, however you perceive that. So, because I think all of us really want a better world for our children. Our plateau is their platform. So what kind of plateau do we build so that we all have this equitable opportunities from that platform? And when we look back on history 20 years from now, will we still be having the same conversation that people were having in the 1930s, the 1920s? Because the conversation has really not changed that much. We just have ways to track data now. So let's keep the conversation on the main stage so that on all the best lists that we're on, we can get on that best list too as a city that truly set the stage to do the very complicated work towards equity and to dismantle racism, which is really has to happen in people's hearts. That has to happen on a lot of individual work has to happen for all of us, irrespective of our race, creed, color, who we love, all those things that we separate each other by, unfortunately. It has to happen it has to happen within all of us.
Yeah, my heart is beating quickly at this conversation, because I think we have to recognize that I think we're in a moment of sort of like popularity and people declaring that they want to be on the right side of history, right? And so people begin to self-educate and use the language, but it's important for the language of equity and anti-racism to be operationalized and not just be sort of shell language, right? So I think that's the muscle that we have to build. So we've been doing work. I say we because it's been a lot of us, many of us, and many residents throughout generations here. And as Dr. Colette Pierce-Bennett said, for her people for 400 years, and for my people as a person with Indigenous roots to the region, like before that as well, right? And so I'm a fifth generation transnational person. That means that I have ties on what became a border, but I have ties as an Indigenous person to a larger region where there are relationships amongst people and people who have survived colonialism for hundreds of years. And so generations of people in my lineage have been having this conversation. I don't want 5 more generations to be having to have the same conversation. I want us to remember that things happened to us in generations, but I don't want us to be stuck in having the same conversation. And so what I think that will take is getting serious about operationalizing these concepts. And recently I was facilitating a conversation with residents around our work on resilience. And some of the questions that we ask people there are about their challenges to their resilience and the resilience challenges that they have, but also those questions about what does it mean to them to have that equitable resilience process. And one of the residents said, I've been in this conversation for 29 years, she said, right? I've been participating in boards and commissions and all of these different things, talking about what we need. And she said, what I really need is for the people who have to show up and talk about how they're going to do more than just sort of like trickle out a little bit more for people. But to actually figure out what they're going to do so that they're not the only ones who have. And they need to be having that conversation, not only the people affected saying, here's how I'm being affected or how I need, and being asked over and over and over again to talk about that, right? So I think we've got to get really serious about the doing, and we have to go beyond just normalizing using the language. Our call to action is what Ruben said, right? And what Ruben is doing, it's the doing, it's the action. And so we have to call ourselves in to do that here in Austin.
Thank you for that, Alba. I think the comment about having the language and using the language is definitely maybe one step in the right direction, but the most important step is how do we actually operationalize that? What does that look like in our work? How do we think about that? How do we center it? And to that point, I know we only have a few minutes left, about 5 minutes left for this panel. So I wanted to try to get to some of the questions. And one question is, I think, related to this idea of, trying to operationalize it and actually do the work is, how do you measure resilience? So if you're doing that action, how are you trying to measure it, and what does progress look like?
To me, resilience is based on quality of life metrics. So one of the reasons I started doing this work and teaching at the university, and prior to that at the Level Up Institute, is I read a report. I don't know if you remember this report that came out about 6 years ago that said your lifespan and quality of life is directly related or correlated to the zip code upon which you live. And so when there was this website you could go to and put your zip code in and say, this is life expectancy, right? This is quality of life. And so to me, that made me mad. And I said, well, hold on, because I came and grew up in 7702 and 7721, now all of a sudden I'm only predicted to live this long. Like, why does this get to tell me, right? I understand how they did the data and the research on the back end, but what I took away with it is saying, because you grew up here, this is as much as your potential can be, right? So to me, how do we measure resilience is looking at all the outputs and current stats of what our current community is living. How long do they live? How have we increased their lifespan, their quality of life, the abilities for them to get quality work? How well are the schools in the community, the jobs that they're getting, the housing, the access to housing, loans and building credit, like looking at the entire system and saying, where are they currently at now? And then how much more can we improve that process for them so that when these disasters show up, they have a base, a foundation upon which they can rely on and be able to make it through. There's a lot of people who are making it through this pandemic who had a lot of wealth and resources already stored up. Some of us, many of us, majority of America is like paycheck to paycheck. And so the fact that we have leaders in our Congress who are debating whether we should get support, intermediate support, and not being able to get us that support we need now, when other countries are immediately stepping in and doing it, it's really reflective of who we are as a country and as a people, and how we need to create a new story about how we take care of the bottom first so that everyone can thrive.
Yeah, and I think just that point about that we have indicators that suggest certain things about livelihoods and kind of ability to move through the world in certain ways is really important to think about, because I think oftentimes when we think about resilience, we tend to think about it maybe in a very specific way. Like we might think of food systems resilience, and that means something, but it is kind of across the board when we think about education, when we think about housing, when we think about transportation. It's all of those things coming together to build more resiliency. And Alba, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what I talked about earlier a little bit in terms of receipts, and that definition of equity that we're trying to work under, which talks about getting to that better state, and that's really the ultimate piece, right? So we want to see real things and real progress in the way that Ruben is talking about, when we're saying we can tangibly see that people get to live longer, right? Who were previously prohibited from doing so because issues of inequity were determining outcomes for them, right? And so I think that we can look to measure this across various aspects of life, but how striking that even in terms of sort of like mortality and when you get to cease to have any opportunity, right? That shows up there in the ultimate. So I think we have to look for sort of real outcomes, and beneath that comes indications of progress toward outcomes. But there is, I think, inequity is built and designed, right? So when Dr. Colette Pierce Burnett talks about 1928 master plan, they knew exactly what they were designing for and planning for. And they knew that in order for certain folks to have certain outcomes that they wanted of living well and good lives, they needed to have X, Y, and Z in place. And so we are on the precipice of the 100-year anniversary of the 1928 plan in the city of Austin. And we know what they designed for, and it has come true, right? We see it in terms of the outcomes for people across the Eastern Crescent and those who have now gone to the expanded Eastern Crescent outside of the city because they've been pushed out, right, by the different things that the 1928 plan set forward as a design plan. And so sometimes I think we get really jumbled up as people like practicing in the space. And again, the over intellectualization of like, measurement, indicators, evidence-based practice all the time. It's very simple, right? For a very long time in this country, we have been designing for certain people to get certain outcomes. There is so much sort of like studying and looking at people who are experiencing inequity, poverty, and resilience challenges to say, what is wrong with you that you are, not doing well, all these things, or what's gonna work, or all these pieces. We actually know what works because we've been designing in this country for a very long time for certain people to have certain outcomes. So I think we have the templates right there. And we know how to measure progress right there, right? Because we've been doing it all along for some groups and not for another. So I think we have to sort of, have a wake-up call and a recall on that to get real about. We already know, right? And we know what to do about it in most cases. It's that political will and that will to do it that Dr. Colette Pierce-Burnett is asking us to have, that we have to plug in to that measurement and tracking on indicators.
Claire, I know we're short on time, but I just want to insert this. I'm just honored to be on this panel with these two laborers, consistent laborers. Benjamin Franklin is attributed, a quote is attributed to Benjamin Franklin that says, "Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are." So when you see a survey that points out the things that Ruben was talking about and the things that Alba was talking about, and you go, oh, wow, that's too bad. You're not outraged. So you won't lean in to do the work. So, and that's how we get to justice. It's not the responsibility of the people who are being, quote unquote, needing to be resilient to fix these systems because they're not empowered to.
Well, I want to thank everybody, and I know we're a little over time, but great job, panelists. I really appreciate the conversation and a great way to kick off the breakout sessions. Thanks to everyone who attended, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. A long time to smile. Thank you guys so much. That was wonderful. I'm sorry. I think I messed it up in the beginning. That was my bad.
No worries. Y'all did a great job. Awesome job, y'all. So yes, next is just going to be the breakout session. So I'm not sure if y'all are going to be in your own breakout panels. But that's where everyone's going to go now, and that's what he's giving everyone's instructions on right now with this video. But y'all did a great job. Sorry, it was kind of just a short time between the last panel and your panel, so I have to be really brief. So, but y'all did an awesome job.